Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Martin, and it is indeed a pleasure to be here with you to talk about self-determination. Before we delve into the topic itself, I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you about who I am and why am I the person who's delivering this webcast on self-determination. First of all, go back in time. I'm actually an Illinois boy. I grew up in East Central Illinois. I'm a graduate of Illinois schools. I worked professionally in Illinois for a few years before I wanted to learn more and to really begin to figure out what it is we need to do in this field. I then went to the University of Illinois in the special education program to study what we now call secondary transition education. Since graduating from Illinois, I've been a professor at the University of Colorado in Colorado Springs, and for the last 20 years, I was a professor at the University of Oklahoma, where I was the director of OU's Zero Center, and I held the Zero Family Chair. And I was a professor in the Department of Educational Psychology program and taught in the special education program. Over the years, I've studied a lot about transition education practices, what work best, created, and along with a team of really talented colleagues, what we can do to teach students to become more self-determined. We've examined and created self-determination and other transition assessments, as well as a whole host of self-determination and transition educational materials. With all that said, self-determination has become the core, or is the core, of everything I've done professionally, because it is the single set of strategies that are so powerful that when they are learned and students apply self-determination skills, they become more successful in school as well as out of school. With all that said, let's begin our discussion on self-determination. So allow me a minute here as I switch things around. I'm going to share my screen and bring up my PowerPoint presentation for today. Here we go. Many thanks to the Illinois Center for Transition and Work, who sponsored this webcast. And today's presentation is titled Self-Determination, the Engine Powering Transition Planning and Education. And I'm Jim Martin. We're going to talk about 5 major points today. We're going to begin briefly with looking at the importance of self-determination. Why is it so important that it's the first webcast that we're going to present on? We'll examine 4 broad facets of self-determination, not in depth, but with an overview focus so you can understand the depth of self-determination. Number 3, we'll look at how self-determination interventions power secondary transition education. We'll look at teaching self-determination as a means to improve school and post-school outcomes of students who do have disabilities. And last, we'll look at transition education legal and policy fundamentals. First of all, let's focus on the importance of self-determination. What we now know from a series of studies and synthesis of these studies is that self-determination improves school performance. Students who are more self-determined have better school performance than students who are less self-determined. Likewise, students who are more self-determined have better post-high school education outcomes. Trade schools, community college, 4-year schools, post-experience education programs. Students with higher levels of self-determination have enhanced post-high school employment outcomes and better post-high school community living outcomes. Think about this. We have a set of strategies that when we provide the opportunities for students to learn these skills and practice these skills, it's so powerful that it can impact every area of students' school and post-school life. That is something that shows you how powerful self-determination methodology is. To understand self-determination, we need to look at least 4 facets of self-determination. Not that this is all there is, but to me, it's the major 4 facets. It's divided into theory and practice. Don't worry, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the theory part. We'll focus mostly on practice, but to understand self-determination, we have to look at it from philosophy, from psychology, as well as the political aspects of self-determination. And then we take what we know as self-determination and apply it to practice in special education. But first, let's begin at the philosophy. Let's begin with philosophy, the philosophical side of self-determination. We're going to go way back to 1715 when John Locke, a famous English philosopher, said, "The ideas of men and self-determination appear to be connected. Men can determine themselves." Today, this seems to just be the way it is. But in 1715, this was a major revelation that men can determine themselves. My historian friends tell me that Locke's philosophical beliefs form the foundation for the American Revolution and the subsequent form of democracy that we have in the United States, which is the idea that men can determine themselves. People can determine themselves. The United Nations, we all know what the United Nations is. The United Nations in 1960 indicated that all people have the right to self-determination. And because of this right, they are free to pursue their economic, their social, and their cultural development. Think about that. The world agreed that all people have the right to self-determination. Over the last few decades, this right has begun to apply to people with disabilities. Like this, self-determination empower groups, such as people with disabilities, to take control of their own affairs and to direct their own futures. For example, here's another example. In 1975, Congress passed the Indian Self-Determination Act. This act enabled tribal governments to govern themselves within their tribal affairs. In the field of disability, self-determination has increasingly been thought of as a basic human right. Wolfensberger, who's the author of the famous book called Normalization, which laid the foundation for a lot of what we do in special education today, clearly said in his book that self-determination must be considered a right for people with disabilities. Must be considered a right for people with disabilities. In psychology, Deci and Ryan are the major psychologists writing about self-determination, and they created what they call the self-determination theory. And to them, it's a theory of motivation, why we do things. And it addresses 3 basic needs that we have: the need for competence, the need for autonomy, and the need for psychological relatedness. Competence is pretty self-explanatory. Autonomy is that people need to feel in control of their own behaviors and their own goals. And for psychological relatedness, people need to experience a sense of belonging to other people. And so when we have competence, autonomy, and psychological relatedness, and those needs are met, individuals will optimally develop and function. The pieces are becoming together as to why we focus on self-determination in special education. In the 1980s, we're going to step into a different part of history now. In the 1980s, a crisis in special education was discovered. The first of what has become numerous studies that examined the post-school outcomes of people with disabilities. These were published, these studies were published. Hazazi and her colleagues, and Mithog and his colleagues, they tracked down former high school students with disabilities to see what they're doing after high school, a few years to several years after high school. And what they found shocked many. They found poor post-high school outcomes, unemployment, underemployment, boredom, just in other words, people were not doing as much as they could be doing. And so this situation raised the eyebrows of many policymakers. And it even changed the purpose of special education. The purpose of special education, as defined in the very first paragraph of IDEA 2004, states that special education is a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet students' unique needs. And special education prepares students for further education, employment, and independent living. So we do special education to prepare students for life after high school. So if it's a student with an IEP in second grade, what we're doing is preparing them for life after high school. Likewise, for a student who is 16 years old and they have an IEP, we're preparing that student for further education, employment, and independent living after they leave high school. That's the purpose of special education. And self-determination has emerged in special education over time. Didn't just pop up and appear magically, but it got into special education a step at a time. And then there was a giant leap that I'll mention here in a little bit. But it began by the adaptability model that Mithog and his colleagues published in late 80s. And this grew from an interest in self-management or self-control strategies that individually had been found to be extremely effective to aid in acquisition, generalization of skills. But no one has really looked at putting them all together in a package. And the adaptability model was one of the first to do this. And the adaptability model put these generic skills such as goal setting, problem solving, and adjustment together to enable students to attain their goal. And goal attainment, according to Michael Waymeyer, is the most important self-determination skill, and one that we most often have to teach students how to attain their goals, both short-term and long-term. So we have the adaptability model as a foundation of special education. And then we have other writers that have come in and other things have happened. Kohler and Field in the early 2000s wrote that we need to teach students self-determination skills as well as others to improve their post-school outcomes. And during this time period, actually in the 90s, Michael Ward said, we have to figure out what self-determination is and develop assessment materials and curriculum materials to teach it. And Michael Ward was at the U.S. Department of Education Office of Special Education Program, and he sponsored grant competitions for different groups around the country to try to figure out what self-determination is. And then IDEA comes along in 2004 and defines transition services as what we do to promote movement from school to post-school outcomes, from school to employment, further education, and independent living. It's not surprising then that an effective methodology such as self-determination began to become the engine driving transition services so students could develop the skills to be more successful as they leave school to go into employment, further education, and independent living. The ability to adapt plays a major role in transition and in self-determination. Schlossberg's transition theory indicates that what happens when someone leaves high school, for example, forces people to adapt. They used to think that they would do this when they're out of high school, but situations have changed, opportunities have changed, and so people have to adapt. To be successful, we have to adapt. And adaptation must happen to facilitate successful transition. It has become such an important part of self-determination that in Mythog and colleagues' self-determined learning theory book, adaptation is a major part of that learning happens in transition when individuals have to adapt to changes. They have to come up with new strategies, develop more supports or new supports, or change their goal, tweak their objectives to be able to attain their goal. So adaptation is a critical part of what transition is all about. There's many definitions of self-determination, and it has always been constantly revised, tweaked. Different authors approach self-determination from different philosophical bends. But my favorite is the consensus definition that Sharon Field and her colleagues put together, where she brought in several of the major people behind self-determination methodology and definitions, and created a consensus definition. And this says that self-determination is a set of skills, knowledge, and beliefs that facilitates individuals' engagement in goal-directed, self-regulated behavior. So think about the adaptability model we talked about earlier that brought together all of these individual self-regulation skills, these self-control skills, such as goal setting and goal attainment. And it came together in a definition of what self-determination is: a set of skills, knowledge, and beliefs that facilitate engagement in goal-directed, self-regulated behavior. One good way to look at what self-determination is through the eyes of someone who is self-determined. So a person who is self-determined will make choices and set goals based on an understanding of who they are. They'll understand their interests, their skills, their limits. In terms of special education, what I like, what I don't like, what am I good at, what are some things I still need to learn, what are my limits, what's my disability? And then we'll express their goals, such as at the transition IEP meeting, to build support for what they want to do, both in the long term and the short term. And then we'll establish a plan to attain their goal. Along the way, as they're working to attain their goal, we'll evaluate their plan. And along the way, we'll adjust their goal or plan to be able to attain that particular goal. So that is what a self-determined person is. To teach self-determination, And the logic behind it, it's easy. If we want someone's self-determination skills to increase, we have to increase the opportunities we have to teach those skills and for individuals to practice those skills. So we need to teach self-determination skills. As Sharon Field and her colleagues said in 1998, we have to teach students with disabilities essential self-determination skills during the school years to facilitate a successful transition to life after high school. Self-determination instruction, according to Kohler and Field, drives the transition education process. But like all good instruction, self-determination instruction begins with self-determination assessment. Now let's look at some transition education foundations so we can see where self-determination rests within this. Paula Kohler created this taxonomy for transition programming, which she and her colleagues updated a few years ago. And it has 5 components. The first part is student-focused planning. Focus on the student and what their strengths, their needs, their dreams happen to be. Engage the family in that transition planning process. What are the program structures we're going to have in place at school and in the community for students to help attain their goals? What agencies are we going to collaborate with to help students receive the support and planning they need to attain their goals? And finally, student development, teaching students the skills they need to become active in their own transition planning process to learn to become more self-determined. And it means that we also have to use transition assessments. As we all know, IEPs have to include post-secondary and annual transition goals. And these goals that we write, the transition goals, have to be based, according to law, upon age-appropriate transition assessments. And these assessments need to go across transition domains: education, employment, independent living when needed. I oftentimes wonder when it isn't needed. And rather than just dismissing it, we should let the independent living assessment results guide us if it's needed or not, but that's a topic for another day. The courts, the district courts, take over when due process hearings result in a decision that isn't accepted. And typically when that happens, parents will then go into a district court to try to get a decision, a different decision oftentimes. And since transition has become a part of what we do in secondary special education, there's been an increasingly large number, not a large number, but an increasing number of cases that end up in federal district courts. A few years ago, Prince and her colleagues examined these district court findings in relation to transition assessment. And the courts in these decisions said, just as how the law said, we have to use multiple assessments across transition domains. But they went on further and said that we just can't use informal assessments. Informal assessments are those that are teacher-made assessments. There are assessments that oftentimes schools buy, and they can cost a lot, but they're assessments that lack ample validity evidence to support their use as a transition assessment. And what the district courts are saying, that at least one assessment we use as a part of our individual student transition assessment battery has to have ample supporting validity evidence. What they say in the print summary is a formal assessment. When we define that, it's one that has ample supporting validity evidence. And the courts have gone on to say that we have to maximize student participation in the transition planning process also. So we start having these pieces of information that are coming together from different points in secondary transition and in the community that brings self-determination to bear. Another concept we need to introduce is the one on generalizable behavior. And clearly, not all skills we teach are equal. Some skills are unique to a particular task or a particular situation. But what we want to teach as transition skills are skills that, when learned, students can apply to a variety of situations. And I think the research has provided, no, I don't think, I know this. Research has provided us an ample set of behaviors now that we know are generalizable and that, when learned, do help students attain their goals and do enable students to become more self-determined. And so we need to focus on those skills that, when learned, will generalize to any post-secondary goal. As we know, as students go through school, they will have one goal for what they want to do when they're out of school. Next year, they may refine it a bit. The year after that, they may switch to a completely different dream of what they'd like to do when they're out of high school. And that kind of career development process is real typical. And different skills are associated with different particular post-secondary goals that students choose. But rather than just focus on unique skills to those goal areas, if we think about focusing on generalizable behaviors that will work for whatever goal the student chooses, we're way ahead of the game. And so we need to focus on skills, especially the annual transition goals, that we know when students learn these skills, they have a greater likelihood of better education, employment, and independent living outcomes. And not surprisingly, the generalizable skills often fall into the self-determination category. Let's look at something a little different, and you'll see why in a second this becomes so important. Think about the last teacher-directed IEP meeting that you were at. Could have been a special ed teacher who was sitting at the head of the table, or the counselor, or the special ed assistant director, whatever educator is in charge of the meeting. Think about what % of time did these people talk at the meeting? What % of time did special education teachers talk? What do you think? 50% of the time, 80% of the time? What about the general ed teacher? 30%, 20%, 5%? Administrator? 2, 15, 20% of the time? Family members, support staff, counselors, rehab counselors, representatives from career technology centers, other support school psychologists that would come in, other support staff, speech therapists fit in that category. What about the student? What % of time did students talk at the typical teacher-directed IEP meeting that you attended? IDEA now tells us that when students reach transition age, they have to attend their IEP meeting when transition's being talked about. So students are there most likely, but when they're, what do they have to say? What % of time do they talk? And then we know how IEP meeting goes. There's quiet times when no one says anything. What % of time does that happen? And also, how often do the meetings evolve into multiple conversations? Somebody's talking about their spring break trip. Somebody else is talking about the dinner they're going to have when they get home. Someone else is talking about, well, what does this assessment result really mean? You know, there's multiple conversations. Got answers to those? What we did, we sat and observed a lot of IEP meetings, and every 10 seconds, we looked up and recorded who was talking at that particular time. It's a very good way of capturing what happens, who talks at an IEP meeting. And what we found out, some of this really surprised us. Special education teachers on average at these meetings talked 50% of the time, family members 15%, general ed 9%, administrators 9%, support staff 6%, multiple conversations happened 5% of the time. Students talked 4% of the time. Now, whose meeting is this? If you look at the numbers, it's clearly adults talking to adults about the student's plan for next year as well as for life after high school. Student is there, they talk 4% of the time. You know, we didn't keep data on this, just anecdotal data. But when adults talked, they never, very seldom did they ever look at the student when they were talking. They almost always looked at the person who was chairing the meeting. And in this case, that was the special ed teacher who was the one who convened and chaired the meeting. Hardly ever did they look at the student when they talked about the student. So not only are the students engaged at the meeting, the adults who were there didn't really talk to the student. Now think about transition. Who discussed transition at these IEP transition meetings? Same roles, what percent of time did they talk? Same, different? Here's what we found out. Special ed teachers still talked about transition 50% of the time. Administrators 8, family 8, support staff 20. Students talked 10% of the time. Higher than they did overall. And most of that was attributable to support staff who came into the meeting, whether it was a counselor from vocational rehabilitation or a representative from the local career technology center. When they came to the meetings, oftentimes they would have deliberate conversations with students, would ask students questions about their future. And as a result, when it came time to talk about transition, students talked a little more than they did overall. But when you look at the whole picture, what do we see? We see adults talking to adults about transition, about next year's education plan, and students kind of just being there, not really engaged in the meeting. And whose meeting is this, after all? Whose meeting is this? The data tell us it's clearly not the student's meeting. What we now know is that as students become more engaged in their IEP meetings, as they become an actual team member, their levels of self-determination increase. And as we know now, as their levels of self-determination increase, their academic performance overall increases, and they have better post-school outcomes. So one real simple way to increase students' level of self-determination is to teach them and then provide them opportunities to become actively engaged in their own IEP meeting. The U.S. Department of Education and their Office of Special Ed and Rehab Services has a mechanism called, I've always heard it as just a letter. And we call this one the Dude letter. And Mr. Dude wrote and asked about who needs to participate in transition IEP meetings. And OSEP wrote back, or OSERS wrote back and said, the parent and students are required IEP team members at IEP team meetings when transition services and goals are discussed. They're required team members, not just that they're there to observe, but they're there as a required team member. And the whole team must take into account students' needs, strengths, preferences, and interests as they're picking their annual and post-secondary goals. So OSERS is now telling us that students have to be considered an actual IEP team member, not just a observer or somebody who's riding along in the back of the bus, so to speak. So the implications of this are clear, that we need to teach students IEP language. We need to teach them their role at the IEP meeting, what they can do, what other people's roles are, and what to do with the IEP meeting. We need to teach them the same set of skills in many ways that special educators are taught about what to do with their IEP meetings. And as educators and parents, when we go into these meetings, we need to expect students to be a part of this as well and encourage their participation. In doing so, we increase students' level of self-determination, and now you know what happens as levels of self-determination increase. So once again, many thanks to the Illinois Center for Transition and Work for sponsoring this webcast on self-determination. For the center, I'm Jim Martin. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.